Okay, so I don't know if anybody saw, probably not because I just posted it on TAR members page this morning. I posted an ominous little post that says everything you thought you knew about the forms in August 18th is now changed. So, yeah.
What does that mean? Everything you've told us is changed?
Not necessarily, but there are some changes. I just got off of an emergency meeting with CAR Legal, CAR Leadership, and the Standard Forms Advisory Committee, and they are making changes to a bunch of forms. So now you guys all remember I said, hey, in June 27th or whatever, there's going to be all these forms released. Well, some forms got released, and then a whole other group of forms, about 12 of them, 13 of them got held back. They were all the forms that had anything to do with compensation, and the DOJ has, so CAR is in 2 active lawsuits. The DOJ continues to call CAR and tell them, you know, what we kind of need to do and what we don't need to do. So the latest and greatest is that there can be no more, Terry, are you listening? There can be no more broker to broker compensation. It's gone. Broker to broker compensation is being eliminated completely. Okay, so that means that, I think that was the email finally going out to you. I don't know why that took so long. I have no idea. No more broker to broker compensation. So the form CBC, Cooperating Broker Compensation Agreement, is being eliminated completely. The form ABCD, the Anticipated Broker Compensation Disclosure, being eliminated completely. All compensation must now be negotiated directly between the buyer and the seller. So that's paragraph 3G3 on the RPA, where you ask the seller to pay the buyer's broker's compensation direct from the seller, right? And so one thing to kind of think about, because I see all your faces like, oh my God, what do we do? It actually simplifies things, guys, because now there's no more confusion on how much are we getting from versus how much are we getting from our buyer. It's basically sellers being paid, the seller's paying the seller's broker, the buyer's paying the buyer's broker, unless the buyer asks the seller to pay the buyer's broker. Pretty.
Does that have to be written that buyer has to ask the seller?
Yes.
To pay his broker?
Correct. That's in the
form or on the RPA?
On the RPA 3G3, which has always been there, right? 3G3 is the buyer asking the seller to pay the buyer's obligation to pay the buyer's broker, and it comes with the accompanying form, the SPBB, the seller to pay the buyer's broker. Okay, so those have been around for a year now. We've had 3G3 and the SPBB for a year, but we've never had to use them because we've always been just taking our offer of compensation from the other side. So this is going to drastically change the way that the residential listing agreement looks. Going to have that in that area where we had all the different forms of how you're going to get paid, that section where broker to broker authorization is going to be gone. And there's going to be other parts of the RPA that disappear as well, like the final page of the RPA that talks about how much one side's paying the other, and an offer of compensation is going to be gone. So anywhere in any of the forms where there's any talk about broker X pays broker Y, going to be gone.
Can the buyer's broker ask concession? Like, are they allowed to do that now? Like, ask for closing costs that's going to cover like their.
So all you can do is ask for concessions, right? That's what the concessions is all about. So concessions essentially, or or asking directly, right? So it's going to be very interesting how this plays forward, because you're not even going to be able to really put in the MLS or outside of the MLS or anywhere that broker A will pay broker B. That's just not going to happen anymore. It's got to come from the seller. So what does that mean when we get into a transaction, when we're negotiating something? And this was a point that was made in the meeting we had today by one of the guys that I think is just brilliant, really cool dude. I'm fortunate that he and I get along because I get to bounce a lot of information off of him. If you have an offer, let's say that, let's just throw a number out. The house is $400,000. and you've written an offer and you've asked the seller to pay your
Are
compensation.
you
that
writing
you're-
that in the offer?
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, you're asking in 3G3, please pay the 2.5% that I'm owed, $10,000, right? And instead, when you're on the seller side or the listing side, instead of trying to counter less compensation, just counter with a higher price. As long as your appraisal will cover it, then you can still fulfill the obligation to pay both sides without changing your net. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
That makes sense. So the thing that he wanted to make sure that, you know, what he's training his agents to do is to not create the net by diminishing the compensation, create the net by raising the price that way. Because what happens if you do it where you diminish the compensation? Now the buyer's on the hook to the buyer's broker to pay that,
Right.
and they may not be able to do it.
And they can
Right.
hopefully probably add it to their loan amount.
Absolutely,
Except
because
for a
you'd be
vet-
raising the
except for a
price.
vet, right?
You'd be
Except
raising
for-
the price. No, I don't know exactly how VA is going to play into it now because they're making some concessions there as well. That's still kind of a work in progress. I think the VA is going to get, you know, we'll hear some clear guidelines by the time we roll around to August 15th. So with that being said, all those forms that have to do with broker to broker payment and compensation are being, the emergency, they just all got rewritten kind of behind our backs as a committee. Over the weekend, the entire CAR legal team with the leadership of Standard Forms wrote all these forms, and these forms they're going to be posted in 2 weeks, and so that they'll be ready to go live on, I think, what did they say? We're getting them posted in 2 weeks so that we're ready to go live on August 17th. So it's going to be like real fast. We're going to have a very short window of time to be aware of these forms. But yeah, just for a mental note, no more broker to broker compensation allowed. So it's just going to put everything on the buyer and seller to negotiate. It actually does simplify things. It's one less step in the mix. All right. So with that said, BRBC, Buyer Representation Broker Compensation Agreement, non-exclusive unless exclusive is checked and initialed. So we've talked about that before, the difference between exclusive and non-exclusive. The non-exclusive is the way that most of us are probably going to go. It's probably the way that you're going to be have an easier time staying in compliance. And it's going to be very difficult for any agent out there to sneakily put somebody into the exclusive because two requirements will have to be met. They'll have to sign in two different spots on the form. So a buyer would definitely know when they are going exclusive. All right. So we'll just go through it step by step. So this is between a buyer and a broker, which is, you know, you guys acting on behalf of me, the broker. The non-exclusive right, unless exclusive is checked in paragraph 2A. So here's A2, 2A2, which is right here. You'd have to check this box exclusive. To represent the buyer in acquiring real property or a manufactured home for the representation period in paragraph 2A. So in paragraph 2A, there is a representation period beginning on and ending at, but you must note that the maximum representation period allowed by law now is only 3 months. You cannot represent somebody for a year or 2 years or indefinitely. It's a maximum 3 months, not 90 days, 3 months.
So we should have like a bunch of these in the car. Like a first-time property.
Well, actually, there's another form that we should probably have in the car if we're going to be showing property. There's a smaller representation agreement that is kind of more built for somebody calls, they want to go look at a house. It's a very simple version of this, and it's maximum for 3 properties. So if you're going to go show somebody, you know, on a day, hey, I'm going to go show you up to these 3 properties. If you write on any of these 3 properties, you're going to pay me. That's basically how it goes, but it's not locking them into a long representation period over a large swath of properties. Okay, type of representation, like I said, it's going to be non-exclusive. Let me just move this out of the way here. I did put some bubbling in here. Let me see what I wrote myself little notes this morning so I would remember to tell you guys what, oh, here we go. So this establishes broker involvement, this section here. So it says, the broker, including any associate licensee working through the broker on behalf of the buyer, provides services for the types of property and the location specified below. So you only get paid if you provide services. And that will be broken out a little further down when we get into the paragraphs, what constitutes broker participation. Yeah, you have to be able to provide some kind of service to get paid. Okay, property type, pretty basic. It defaults at single family residential, including condominiums and manufactured homes, known as single family residences. If you're going to be showing them other things, or if your buyer doesn't know whether they want to buy commercial or industrial or vacant land or a mobile home, you would have to come in and check all the boxes that apply. The location, counties, cities, you can't put a blanket in for the entire state. Typically for us, we would be looking at Kern County, Los Angeles County, right? If you got somebody that maybe doesn't know if they're going to live in Lancaster or Rosamond or Mojave or where, it could be any one of our counties. So you're going to put in those counties or cities. You might just put in Tehachapi, you know, kind of yourself. You might want to throw in Kern. Additional description. So if there's something specific, maybe you just want to keep it to the Antelope Valley, so you put in Los Angeles County, but now you're just going to put an additional description to be, you know, Antelope Valley. I'm not necessarily going to represent you if you're buying in Santa Monica. Okay, so so B2 and B3 are the blanket properties. That's anything we look at in all of Kern County during the period of time. Now, if your client doesn't want to be fully committed to you in that way, you could say, or that maybe they're saying to you, you know what, I don't know if I'm going to live in Tehachapi or if I'm going to live in Bakersfield, but I got an agent in Bakersfield. So maybe you say, okay, fine. I'm going to represent you for the following specified properties only. And I'm going to write a list. Maybe I'm going to go show you 6 properties today. And I'm going to put a list of those 6 properties. Now, what could you write in there? You could write in the addresses, sure. Or even simpler, just write in the MLS numbers, right? Because those are just what, 6-digit numbers, 7-digit numbers, whatever they are. So you can put those in there. I'm going to go show you 9990142, 9990473, or whatever it is you're going to show them. So you could put those in there. Or you could put the properties identified on the attached list. So you could check that box. It's going to create text overflow addendum, and you could list those properties. Now, if your people don't want to have that blanket and they want to just kind of do it property specific as you go show them, you have this BRBC, you go show them 6 properties today, they come up next week. Do you have to write another BRBC? No, write an addendum to the BRBC and attach those properties that you're going to show them the following week. So you would just keep making modifications to your BRBC by adding addendums. That makes sense? Okay, this section here, properties excluded from representation. What do we think this means? Why would we have that?
They looked at that house with another agent.
Looked at a house with another agent and they already have a buyer's representation agreement with that other agent. So that is the existence of previous valid BRBCs as other brokers.
But
So-
would you be privy to that? Like, are
They have to tell you, right? They have to tell you when you're signing it. You have to ask them, do you have any other BRBCs out there? And they say, yeah, I went and looked at houses with so-and-so. Which houses did you look at? Is it blanket or is it property specific? They may say, well, no, it's these 4 properties. I saw these 4. I have a BRBC for those 4. You have to know that if they choose one of those 4, you're out.
What happens if they're not honest about other agreements?
So if they're not honest about other agreements and they sign a BRBC with you that's blanket and covers that property, you go into contract with them and the other broker finds out that that buyer is under contract on that property, they can drop their BRBC off too, and now your buyer has to pay 2 commissions.
Which can totally feel if they're not really
Absolutely.
sure.
But the question is, does it kill your commission? And you'll find out later in this form that says you get paid at the completion of a contract, or if if the contract is stalled by the buyer from the buyer defaulting. So in that scenario where they did that and then they're going to default now, you could take them to court and say it was on your lack of good faith and fraud towards me that I didn't get paid. You could still sue them.
Let's hope that just never happens.
Yeah, let's hope
That's
that
just
let's hope
never-
that never
Like, I
happens.
just feel like I have such a relationship with my clients. That's
So,
never gonna
The
happen.
point is, ask the question,
Yeah.
right? We got to ask the question. Got to ask the question. Okay, additional buyer preferences and priorities. So this is the form BIPP. This is the one we've talked about this form in the past. It's on hold, on delay right now, but this is basically their materials issues. What is it that they're looking for in a property? This is their preferences of the property. So you will sit down with them. It's a very nice form. How many square feet are you looking for? You're looking for how many bedrooms? You're looking for a pool, no pool? Does it have to have horse facilities? All the different things. Because remember now, when we go into a agreement with our buyer and we have a representation agreement with our buyer, we have a duty, a legal duty to find them as close to the type of property that they want to have as possible. So they have to give us a wish list, and then we have to try to find properties that match that wish list. Okay, let's go on to compensation. Always, with all of our forms, before we talk about compensation, there's always the cookie cutter up here, letting everybody know that the rate of commissions not fixed by law. They're negotiable, fully 100% negotiable. Okay, so let's talk about compensation. This is the amount of money that your buyer owes you. Okay, it's either a percent of the acquisition price. So people would put 2.5, 3%, 6%, 2%, whatever it is that you are going to work for. And then it has this and over here. What would this be for? We've talked about this before.
An exact price. TC fee?
A TC
Oh,
fee,
okay.
a transaction fee, any other fee that you might have out there. So you might say, if you're going to push the cost of a TC off to your buyer, I'm going to charge you 2.5% and $400.
Can I ask,
Okay.
so you're gonna have to discuss the compensation amount, like essentially before you show somebody houses?
Absolutely, 100%.
Oh,
Yes, because
that's
who's
so-
paying you now?
That's so
Who's paying you
awkward.
now, the seller or the buyer? Who's
The
paying you?
buyer.
The
It's on
buyer.
Buyer now.
It's on the
so
buyer now. So you have to have a conversation with the buyer
I guess
about.
it's just like having the conversation to somebody who wants to sell their house immediately. You talk about the compensation. just
Absolutely.
To list their house.
So it's either gonna be a percent of the acquisition price, or what's this one for? Flat
A
fee.
set.
Flat fee, right? This one's a flat fee. So this could be 2.5% of the acquisition price, or this one here could be, or I'm gonna charge you $5,000. We're gonna go buy a house. I don't care what the house is worth, whether it's $200,000 house or a $2 million house, you're gonna pay me $5,000.
Ooh,
Right? So
nobody
that's
likes
if you
that.
want that's if you want a flat fee. Or pursuant to the compensation schedule attached, which is incorporated herein. So you might have a sliding scale that says, if we buy a house for 300,000 and less, you're going to pay me $4,000. And if we buy a house from $300,000 to 500,000, you're going to pay me $7,000. If you buy a house over, or whatever, or different percentages for different price points. So you could put in some kind of a schedule in there. Okay. Now here is the, let's see, did I do it here? Oh yeah, there you go. Okay, I got a little one in here. Okay, payments from third parties shall be credited against the buyer's obligation to pay the broker. So wherever you get paid from, whether it's from the seller, it really isn't going to come from the broker anymore. This was really, this form is from last month when brokers could still pay brokers. But if any third party pays you in this transaction, that amount gets deducted from what the buyer is obligated to pay you. So if the buyer is obligated to pay you 2% and somehow somebody else pays you 1%, now the buyer only owes you 1%. You cannot get paid more than whatever is in paragraph 2D1. Okay, so what does this do? So you cannot, the most, what I got, there we go, look at that, it's a big one. There it is. The most you can make representing the buyer is the amount in 2D1. Therefore, if you undercut your commission to beat out other agents, you are just undercutting yourself. Any payment from any other party is subtracted from what the buyer owes you. So if somebody says to you, well, so-and-so down there is only gonna, they said they'd only charge me 2% for representation, and you say, well, you know what, I'll just charge you 1%. That's all you can make. Even in the old paradigm, if the listing was going to cooperate and give you 2, they could only give you 1. You can only make
Because
what
of
you
this
put.
signed
You can
contract.
only make what you put in here.
Can you
This is-
amend this to change
You
it?
can amend it, absolutely, if the buyer allows you to amend it.
That's weird, no?
It's always, this is the way this is always was supposed to be. You can only, because otherwise what happens is you got a bunch of people running around town going, I'll represent you for $1, just to get the representation and then get paid somehow over that. So the law stated, to make this fair and equal, whatever is in this agreement as what you're going to be compensated is the maximum you can make. So don't undercut yourself. Don't undervalue yourself. You're only going to make what you put in that section. All right. How do you guys like my bubbles? Those are new.
Yeah.
Those okay?
Yes.
All right. Fun. Okay. The only time that this changes, and we'll get to it in paragraph 4F, is when you are taking a buyer to a listing that you have. So you have a house listed, and now you're bringing the buyer to it. What the seller is paying you to sell their house does not get credited to what the buyer owes you for helping them buy that house, because you have 2 separate agreements. You have a buyer representation agreement that the buyer is obligated to pay you, and then you have a listing agreement to where the seller is obligated to pay you. You do not have that payment from the seller does not get credited towards your buyer. They both have to pay you. Now, your buyer can still ask your seller to pay that obligation, right? Your seller ends up paying all of it anyway. And I think that's what's going to happen most of the time with most of this, even though there's going to be no formal offers of compensation from broker to broker. And there's going to probably be no place, I don't know what our MLS is going to do, but probably no place where there's going to be concession amounts that they're willing to pay. Every single offer is going to have the buyer asking the seller to pay, and it's going to be part of the negotiation. So instead of us just negotiating days of escrow companies, home inspections, price, etc., now just throw in compensation into that mix. We're going to be negotiating compensation on every single transaction. All right. Any questions so far? Yay.
Totally
All right.
confusing.
Simplify it in your brain. Simplify it in your brain. Just no more broker to broker. Everything's got to be buyer to seller. Everything's buyer to seller.
So for prior contracts, listing contracts, are we going to have to change our documents?
Yes, our modification form, I think, is also going to be probably changing. So they're going to be rewriting it because our current modification to our current contract still allows for the broker to broker. And now that's going to just go away completely. So what's going to happen as we roll into August 17th, you're going to have your seller sign the modification of their listing agreement that states there can't be no more broker to broker, that if there's going to be any compensation going to that buyer's agent, it's going to have to come directly from the seller across, which they kind of were prepared for already. If there was going to be a broker to broker, you've already had that conversation with them, right? Makes sense?
Well, so if you have a 4% total, and then you have to get a modification of that contract,
Mm-hmm.
are they paying the listing brokers 4%?
Theoretically, right?
Right.
So yeah, you're gonna have to. We're gonna see how all of that works. I don't know. That's a really great question. So what Cheryl's asking is, if you have a 4% contract, that's 2 and 2, right? And now there's gonna be no more broker to broker. When we flip over to August 17th, and you haven't sold that house yet, it's not an escrow yet. Now does the seller owe you 4% still? I mean, because originally, from a theoretical standpoint, I'm going to say, yeah, they still owe you 4% because that's what they agreed to. They were going to pay you 4, and then they authorized you to give 2. But that first agreement part, that I'm paying you 4, is still 4. So you're probably going to want to go back and have conversations with them. And that's a really good point. I'll ask the forms committee, because I can see a lot of really pissed off people that get stuck in that lurch right there. So yeah, good question. Good question. Okay, next section, continued right to payment for broker involved properties. So within blank calendar days after the representation period or any extension. So this is very similar to the listing agreement. These are called our continuation rights. So these agreements that are non-exclusive, so let me back that up. So we think about a listing agreement. Can a seller cancel a listing agreement with you unilaterally without my approval? Can a seller cancel?
No, you have to approve.
No,
You have to approve it?
I have to approve it. So when we lock a seller up on a listing agreement for 6 months and they want out after 3 months, I don't have to let them go. Why? Because I have, what's my listing agreement called? It's exclusive.
Right.
It's an exclusive right to sell. Okay, which means when it's exclusive, we have to have bilateral, both sides have to agree to cancel it. This contract, this BRBC, unless we make it exclusive, which you guys probably won't, it's non-exclusive. Because it's non-exclusive, either side can cancel it. Your buyer can say, I don't like you, I'm out of here. And you can say, hey, buyer, I don't like you, I'm out of here. Okay, so this can be canceled by one side or the other. So what it says later down in paragraph 4C, and we'll just open up the little box here and get a little preview. All right. You must deliver to the buyer of list of properties for which you have broker involvement for this clause to take effect, either prior to its natural expiration or within 5 days of cancellation. So if this is a 90-day agreement and you're on day 85, right? You're on day 85, and you still want to get paid, and they're not going to re-up with you and they don't want to extend, but you showed them 12 houses and you worked your ass off, then prior to that 90th day, you have to give them a list of these 12 houses that you had broker involvement in and let them know this is the list that you give your next agent. And when they're filling out this section up here, the properties excluded section, you need to give this list to that agent. Because if that house goes under contract with you and I find out about it, I'm going to take this BRBC and drop it off in escrow, and then you're going to owe both of us. Okay. So you have to give them a list, either prior to the expiration, or if, say, you got a 90-day contract and they want out after 21 days and they just send you a cancel app, I'm canceling it, boom, you got till the 26th day to get them that list. It gives you a 5-day grace period to put together that list and deliver it to them. All right. Make sense? That's how you,
What a mess.
that's how you retain your rights for the work. All right. And bubble go away. All right, so cancellation notice, when we're in the non-exclusive, it defaults that it's going to be effective upon receipt, meaning if either party decides to cancel this, it's effective immediately. Okay. Or you can discuss with your client and say, hey, look, if you want out, can you at least give me a day or 2 days or 3 days, whatever, but you can't put 120 days in there. Okay. You can't do that. And then if it is exclusive and both sides cancel, then it's effective 30 days after receipt. If you decide to cancel prior, you can still hold them to it for 30 days. Okay, the buyer financial personal information form. This was developed when we did the BIPP, their preferences. The original buyer materials issue form wasn't good enough to cover everything. So what we did is we separated the forms. The BIPP talks about their preferences for the property. The BFPI talks about their financial position and their ability to buy the home. So this form in it asks them, what do you do for a living? How much money do you make? Who's your lender? You know, where are you getting your money from? Do you have the down payment, et cetera, et cetera. So you fill out that form with them because, again, we're into a contract with them. You have to go out there and find them a home. They have to show you what's one of the 3 C's that I always talk about? Capacity. They got to show you capacity, right? That they have the ability. What are the 3 C's? Anybody know the 3 C's of buying a house? No? Capacity, right? The ability, credit, collateral, right? Got to have money. You got to have income, you gotta have good credit. Those are the 3 C's. Very important to have the 3 C's.
Okay, so
Yes.
slow down. We have to get this form now.
Yeah, so yes, you have to get this form within 5 days.
Within 5
Okay.
days
And you have to,
representing our buyer.
yes, after they sign this BRBC, they have to prove to you that they have the financial capacity to move forward with this purchase.
Well,
Okay,
that's gonna change some things. We won't be working for people that just want something to do on a Sunday.
Right, they don't,
afternoon.
they're looky-loos.
yeah, the looky-loos, the days of
That's
taking
going
people
away.
out, looky-loos is gone. It's
That's
gone.
good.
Yeah.
Right? Because you cannot show a house without representation agreement. Okay, now, can a buyer be unrepresented? Absolutely. Who's gonna show them the house?
No one.
Like, can you just be a nice person and do it?
But if you do, all you can do is open the door. You can't say a word. You can't say anything about the house. You can't talk about price. You can't negotiate anything. You can't talk about the neighborhood, because any of those things that you would say or do constitute business. You have to have a license for, you have to be a licensed real estate agent to talk about those things. Now you're working for them and they don't have a representation agreement with you. So no. Right now they can go to a FSBO, they can go knock on the door, talk to the owner direct and go in and do it on their own. But if they want to be unrepresented, you're basically, your hands are tied and your mouth is sealed. Okay.
Interesting.
Buyer intends to purchase using a VA loan. Now, with the VA doing what the VA is doing, I'm not sure if this is going to be in the final draft or not, but what was that there for? You needed to know, since they cannot use their closing costs or concessions, you needed to know if they had a VA loan, because then you need to figure out how you're going to get paid. You may not get paid. And in that case, so this is going to change, because in that case, the only way you could get paid is if there was an offer of compensation from broker to broker. And now that we're getting rid of that completely, that kind of eliminates that entire line right there. So don't know what's going to happen with the VA people yet. I think what's happening, and I think what I've heard, is that they're going to allow the VA buyers to use concessions to pay their commission. I think it's probably what's going to happen. All right. Or this box, great box. Buyer does not have sufficient funds to pay the broker. Again, why would they check that box? So that you knew, like you knew, if I'm going to take you to look at this house and there was an offer of compensation, then I know where I'm going to get paid. But if I take you to go look at this house and there is no offer of compensation, I'm not getting paid. Right? But here's the funny little caveat about that part right there. All right, this does not mean you shall not show homes that do not offer compensation. That would be a fair housing violation. Rather, the buyer must know if they want to proceed with these houses, they may have to represent themselves. So essentially, if they don't have the ability to pay you and they want to buy a house and there is no compensation coming over, you are not obligated to represent them. So, and it will say that later in this form, if there is no ability for them to compensate you, then you are not required to represent them. So our form is protecting agents for representation for free. Doesn't exist, right? You don't want to do it.
So if somebody, if you're taking somebody to go see a property and they're like, okay, we'll pay you, 1%. Can you then, if you're putting in an offer and you want to charge 3, you can ask the seller to no.
I was wondering.
Nope, because right here. So if they're telling you they're going to pay you 1%, then their BRBC is going to have a big fat 1 right there. And you cannot get paid more than what's in that box.
What
Yes.
if they check, the last box, they don't have any funds at all to pay?
Mhm.
And they want to
So then
ask
you're going to
the
have
seller.
so
seller for
yeah,
all
so they're going to have to ask the
2.5.
seller. So
But
if
there's
they
a 0 on there.
So
Yeah.
you would never put a 0 here, because why would you ever take a BRBC for 0? So you could take, that's a great question. You could take a BRBC for 3%, right? And then they could say down here that they don't have sufficient funds to pay you.
Okay.
Okay, what does that mean? That
They're
means
gonna ask the
every offer you write, you're gonna have to ask the seller to pay that 3%. Okay,
Which is probably what we're missing a lot of, I would imagine.
gonna see a ton of it. Absolutely, especially first-time buyers, FHA buyers. These people are struggling for their 3.5% down on their closing costs. they're gonna say, yeah, sure, I'll pay you 2.5% to go out and buy me a house. And then you're gonna get the BFPI and they're gonna be like, dude, you can't pay me. You don't have any money. So, okay, so we're gonna have to ask every single seller to pay you. And if that's the case, we may end up over asking price. You may have to theoretically, like you were saying, finance my commission over the next 30 years because we're gonna have to bump up the price to create the space for me to get paid.
I'm so intrigued to see how this is gonna play out.
So let's think about it though, from one standpoint. Now, say I'm a seller and I have a house for $400,000, and before I was going to pay 5%. I was going to pay 20 grand out the door. Now I'm only going to pay 2.5%. So I'm only paying 10 grand out the door. Now this is where the conversation gets interesting because sellers are greedy, right? And you're going to try to tell them, look, man, you're only paying me 10,000 now. So don't be offended when they ask for another 2.5%. It's going to be just like the old days. They're going to go, no, I want that extra 10,000. They pay for their own selves. That's where the conversation, that's where the friction's going to be, right? Because they're going to get greedy all of a sudden, even if you explain it to them that it's the same as it's always been. There's going to be friction there. They're going to want everything. So yeah, it's going to be fun. Going to be fun. Okay. Broker's right to compensation. Okay. The other one above it was just, again, the standard one, the amount of commissions not fixed by law. So the broker shall, this is above this, we're doing this black section right here, paragraph B. Broker shall be entitled to compensation specified in 2D1. That's the amount that they say they're going to pay you from the buyer if during the representation period or any extension thereafter, the buyer enters into an agreement to purchase, lease, or otherwise acquire the property described in 2B. Basic. Okay, non-exclusive representation. This is the definition of broker involvement. This is what we are going to be doing. Compensation is payable only if there was broker involvement with the property. What does that mean? It's a number of things. These are not all of these things. These are or. Either the buyer physically entered and was shown the property by the broker or agent, or the broker or agent showed the property to the buyer virtually. Okay, so that could be they're at a remote location and I have my FaceTime camera on and we're walking through the house together. Or the broker submitted to the seller a signed written offer from the buyer to acquire, lease, or exchange the property. So now I'm in the negotiation process. Or the broker performed a market analysis related to the property or reviewed the property's specific documents or disclosures with the buyer. So you got the disclosures ahead of time, you're talking about the property, you're analyzing the property, you're telling them whether or not it's worth what the market should bear. You're working. That's broker involvement. Or the property was introduced to the buyer by the broker for one which the broker acted on the buyer's behalf. Okay. Now, here's the big caveat. Here's the but. However, merely sending a list of properties to the buyer, to the properties shall not be deemed broker involvement without documented action on part of the broker analyzing the property for the buyer specifically or assisting the buyer in the potential acquisition of the property or communicating with the seller or seller's agent regarding the property. So what does that mean? It means that if I have you on a portal, if I have you on a drip, if I'm sending you emails that are auto-generated by my website and you're looking at properties, that is not broker involvement.
Is it only auto-generated?
Yeah, so even if you sent a list manually, went click, 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 send, if you don't analyze each one of those and explain to them why this is worth, you know what I'm saying? You got to do work.
So I do work for all of my buyers or potential buyers by CMAs. So now we're going to save all that documentation. We're going to make sure.
Absolutely, yes. If you're working with the
file.
buyer and the buyer has a question about a house and you build a CMA for that house,
Right.
that is broker involvement right there.
Right.
It's for broker performed a market analysis related to the property.
So from now on, I will have a file for every buyer and every home that I have shown them.
If you've shown them a home, yep, absolutely.
And CMA I have, and I can back that up with just printing out my correspondence with them. I mean, you can
Absolutely.
show your work.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's
But
a
you
really,
need to
really
keep
good
it.
idea would be to keep every showing sheet that you prepped,
I'm going to.
right?
So
Like
you
I
said
showed you
that-
this house and have the appointment times written on them,
Okay.
you know?
I'm gonna do that.
So I mean, I do that anyway. When I have it, I'm taking out 5 or 6 people. I write the time so I know where I'm
Right.
supposed to be at what time. But now I'm gonna put like the date and the
Right.
time in the client's name. It's like these are the houses I showed you on this day. Because when they argue that and I take that paperwork to court, boom, I win every time.
Right.
I
If
win
you send a
every
list
time.
of properties and you say, I think you'll like this one because of this one's not good because of this, does that count?
Absolutely, because you're analyzing those properties. Correct. Based on, at this point in time, would be based on their BIPP, the buyer's intended
Yeah.
preferences and whatever, you know.
Okay, hold on. I'm gonna put you on hold for a moment. Okay, one. Yes. What I've done, and I don't, is, I'm sure it's acceptable, because it has the date, the time my clients are coming, I'm showing their names, and then 1, 2, 3, 4.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay.
That's great.
I'm
I think a lot
sorry.
of people aren't even gonna do that. I think if you're keeping track, if you're logging what you're showing to who, 100%. Yeah.
For the, or actually our clients, so they can make notes and see what they saw and when they saw it. What was in Bear Valley, what was in Stallion Springs, what was in Golden Hills, which is a good thing. But I'm half into that compensation deal. And it has to be a talk, obviously, with the buyers, but we're letting them know if there's not a compensation for.
There will no longer be any compensation for any house you show from a broker.
Yeah.
It
and-
must come from the seller.
So it needs to be put in our offer.
Yes, the 3G3 is gonna be checked all the time now, unless your buyer is totally cool with paying you.
Okay,
Yeah, which, I mean, that's gonna be a really, really huge cliff for all the buyers of the world to start jumping off of, because they haven't had to do it yet. And hardly any, I mean, very rarely do we see a buyer paying.
I'm okay with it.
You've done it a couple of times. Maryland just did one where she got the seller and the buyer to both pay her. So it can happen. It's just not typical. So it's going to be so none of us really have a great conversation based around it. So we're all going to have to get better at how we talk about it. So we're going to have to work on our scripts, and
Right.
we're going to have to work on the
We're
way
gonna have to
that we
do some,
communicate. Yeah, a lot of role play.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, so that's one way you get paid. Let's
so
see,
we know that we're
exclusive
connected. Oh,
representation. So another way you would get paid is if you have exclusive representation, you're gonna get paid no matter what, right? So when you have exclusive representation, even if they go use a different agent to buy the house, you still get paid. But again, we probably aren't gonna be doing exclusive representation, so we're not gonna put too much effort into that one. Okay, and then buyer includes any person or entity other than the broker related to the buyer or whom in any manner acts on the buyer's behalf to acquire the property. So that basically means if you sign this agreement with the husband and the husband only, but then the wife is the one on the contract, you still get paid because the wife and the husband are related, or son, or grandfather, or dad, or whomever they end up having, because a lot of times that happens, right? A daughter will come talk to us, want us to go show houses, and oh, by the way, my dad's buying it for me. So this is protecting us from many of those types of, they can't weasel their way out of there by trying to use a family member. Okay, all right. Yes.
What if it's two people that aren't related, like a couple that aren't married?
No, because it says here, well, I mean, it says related to the buyer or who in any manner acts on the buyer's behalf. So I would still say yes.
Okay.
If they're acting on the buyer's behalf, yes, you still get paid. Okay, continuation of right of compensation. We talked about that a little earlier. This is that 5-day, got to send them a list. So this is just breaking it out. The broker shall be entitled to compensation if within the time specified, which is the length of the contract, or there is a cancellation within that same amount of time or after the effective date. Buyer enters into an agreement to acquire a property for which there was broker involvement. prior to the expiration of this agreement or any extension, or if there is a cancellation within 5 days after the effective date, the broker delivers to buyer a written notice of those properties for which there was broker involvement. So there's a form for that. It's called the NBIP. It's basically notice of broker involved properties. All right, so that's the form you're going to give them within the 5 days. If they cancel on you, you have 5 days. If they aren't canceling on you, you just have to do it prior to the cancellation, prior to the expiration of this agreement. Give them the NBIP with the list of properties that you've shown them that there has been broker involvement in. Okay, timing of compensation, basically meaning when do we get paid? So compensation is payable upon these 3 things: upon the completion of any resulting transaction and through escrow. Right? We don't get paid directly from the buyer. We get paid through escrow. So what does that mean? That means that the buyer is responsible for depositing your commission into escrow as part of their closing costs. Okay. So the broker shall be entitled to compensation whether any escrow resulting from this agreement closes during that time. Okay. So basic, you close the transaction, escrow is going to pay you just like they always have before. It's just that now, instead of coming out of seller proceeds, it's coming out of buyer deposit. Okay, you get paid if acquisition is prevented by default of the buyer. And when do you get paid? Immediately upon the buyer's default. Okay, now that does not mean that they are in their 17-day contingency period and they don't like the house and there's problems with the house and they back out of the deal. That is not the buyer defaulting. What is the buyer defaulting? Seller gives them a demand to close escrow. Buyer doesn't close the escrow. Then they cancel. Buyer was in default. You get paid.
So there has to be funds in escrow to cover your commission?
From the buyer, unless during the RPA negotiation, it's agreed that the seller is going to make that payment. So paragraph 3G3 in the RPA, where the buyer asks the seller to pay their obligation, transfers, it shifts the requirement of commission to the buyer's agent from the buyer to the seller. So once that happens in the negotiation of a contract, then your buyer does no longer has to deposit those funds into escrow. Does that make sense? Want me to say that again?
Yes.
Okay,
Say
let
it
me say
again.
that again. Okay. In the RPA, paragraph 3G3, where the buyer asks the seller to pay the buyer's responsibility to pay the buyer's broker, you're essentially taking the burden of payment and shifting it from the buyer to the seller. So in that case, that would happen as we are opening escrow. Escrow is going to know all of the money for the seller's agent and the buyer's agent is coming from the seller. So they will not ask the buyer to deposit funds for the commission. Now, if that has not been established and the buyer is responsible for the buyer's brokerage, then yes, when they get that request for the wire that says you owe X amount, you got to deposit your funds, Mr. Buyer, it's going to have your commission in that number. So that number is going to be big. It's going to be their down payment, it's going to be their closing costs, and it's going to be your commission. And it's got to be deposited into escrow before escrow will close the file, because the money has to be there liquid to distribute to the buyer's agent. Make sense?
It makes sense.
I can do it one more time.
No, that makes sense.
Okay. Makes sense? I mean, it's a big burden on the buyer. Huge burden on the buyer if you're not negotiating with the seller direct. And again, when you go to a listing appointment, the conversation with that seller is going to be, this is a massive burden on the buyer. So expect that you're going to get a request to pay.
So when the buyer deposits makes an earnest money deposit, the other funds have to be?
No, this usually happens towards the end of the transaction before the lender funds. Normally you have to put it, so let's say you're doing conventional, right? 20% down. You only put what, 2, 3, 4,000 in as an earnest money. Then at the end, you got to put the rest of your 20% in,
Right.
and your closing costs, your homeowner's insurance, your taxes, all that stuff. And now your buyer's commission. It's all going to be down there on the tail end. Yeah. So this is why we need to know up front whether or not our buyer has the ability to pay us. Because if they don't, and they want to buy that house anyway, and there is no concessions being offered to pay us, then you can release them and say, you're on your own.
But what if they're gonna get that money to pay you in the loan, like they don't have it now, but they're gonna have it?
The only way they could do that is if, the only way you can do that is if the seller agrees to pay you and all you've done is elevated the price point. Then it's going to be in the loan. They can't get a loan to pay you. Lender's
Right.
not going to give them a loan to pay your commission.
Okay,
Not gonna happen.
so having that conversation, like, yes, I'll pay you the 2.5 or 3%, then that's gonna be included in loan, and then you already know that.
No, it's only going to be included in the loan. It will never be included in the loan.
In the purchase price.
Maybe you have to ask for it
The
from
seller
the other
has to
side. The
agree.
seller has to pay for it. And all I'm saying is, when you ask the seller to pay for it, it's just smarter to not try to counter with reducing the buyer's commission. It's just smarter to raise the price, because you're going to see a lot of deals come to a dead halt. If the seller counters your commission, then the buyer's still responsible for your commission. And if the buyer doesn't have the money to pay it, it's going to come to it. The whole getting under contract is going to come to a halt. But if you guys can just agree to raise price, then you can move forward. And then your only real concern at that point is going to be, does the property appraise? Right? And guys, I expect there's going to be an adjustment in the appraisals.
Yeah.
There's going to be a huge adjustment in appraisals. And I wouldn't be shocked if appraisers start asking, is the seller paying commissions out of this? And did you guys raise the price? And then how did we go from an original contract price of 400,000 and now I got a seller counter offer at 410? What's going on here? Are you guys trying to raise the price to pay commissions? So there's going to be, I could see a Phil Price of the world, or somebody, you know, who's very strict, bumping into trouble with appraisals. Right? There's gonna be some appraisal stuff out there. Should be fun. Okay, the third way you get paid: if the acquisition is prevented by a party to the transaction other than the buyer. Who's a party of the transaction that's not the buyer? The seller, right? So when the buyer collects damages by suit, settlement, or otherwise. So when does that ever happen? So let's say the buyer sends the seller a demand to close escrow, and the seller doesn't close the escrow, and then the buyer cancels. The seller was in default. So what does the buyer do? They take the seller to court for non-performance, and then let's say they win a $40,000 suit. Out of that money, they got to pay you your commission. Okay, so if the seller, only and only if the buyer, it says here, the compensation shall be equal to 1/2 of the damages recovered, not to exceed the compensation provided for in paragraph 2D1. So it depends on how much they win. You get 1/2 of it up to the amount that you could get before. So if they only win $10,000 and you were supposed to get 15, you only get 5. If they win 10, you get 5. If they win 12, you get 6. But if they win 40, you only get 15. You don't get 20. Make sense? All right, cool. Cool. So here it is right here, payment through escrow. Buyer hereby irrevocably assigns to the broker the compensation provided for in this agreement from the buyer's funds in escrow. The buyer agrees to submit to escrow any funds needed to compensate the broker under this agreement. Broker may submit this agreement as instructions to compensate the broker to any escrow regarding the property involving the buyer and seller, or any other transfer. Okay, so what does that mean? Buyers agreeing to put their funds into escrow to pay you, because you're getting paid through escrow. You're not taking money direct from anybody. All right, accounting for payments to broker. If broker also represents the seller. This is the double ending clause. Okay, notwithstanding paragraph 2D2, if the broker has a listing agreement with the seller of the property purchase, no credit towards the buyer's compensation obligations shall be given for the amount due to the broker by the seller for the compensation broker is owed as the seller's agent. I know that is a total legal sentence, and it just like runs on and on and on and on. What does that mean? I have 2 agreements. I have a listing agreement and I have a buyer representation agreement. Now, in the old model, as a buyer representation agreement, if I'm getting paid by the other side, it's a credit, but not in the case of dual representation. Because
I apologize, hold on.
remember, if I only have a buyer representation agreement and I'm going to buy a home from Cheryl, and Cheryl was offering compensation when they could, I only have one agreement in place. Her payment is satisfying my one agreement. Now, if I have dual representation, I have two separate agreements. They don't satisfy each other. They stand
Yeah,
alone.
I got it.
So they're both responsible. Okay, so that's basically what this is saying right here. So, and I think in my little box, what did I write? This allows you to double in properties and not have the payment of the seller to be counted towards the buyer's agreement to pay. Remember, there are two agreements.
She's talking about. So, yeah, I'm curious how that's gonna play out, when we get the new forms, because when we modify each of these listings.
Yeah, we're gonna have to do some serious modification probably of these lists. I think that modification form's probably gonna change. So remind me of that again, and I'll ask my buddy Dan. You know, we'll put together a perfect question for him, and I'll send it to him and see what he says. Okay, third-party payments. So we're really not gonna have really any third-party payments now because we're not having any really broker-to-broker payments anymore. So this section's probably gonna come out of the BRBC. And same with this section here. See, I did this, I actually did these little notes this morning at 7 o'clock, and then I had my 8 o'clock meeting. So literally within the matter of an hour, all my little notes kind of went to heck. So there will be no anticipated payments. There would have been before. What would have been an anticipated payment? Well, there was an offer of compensation, right? So if there was an offer of compensation, and I said to you, you're going to pay me 3%. We're going to go find a house. We find Cheryl's house, and there's a 2.5% offer of compensation. I need to notify you immediately that I'm anticipating being paid 2.5%. So now you're going to owe me half
Because I
a
have two
percent.
listings and they are willing to pay 2.5 to the other
Yeah,
side.
not anymore. It's going to change.
That's changing.
It's going to change. Yeah, there are no. I mean, you're going to have.
All of.
They can
those
still
listing
give that
agreements.
though, right? It's
Yes,
just-
but it's got to come in the form, in the offer, and they have to ask you for it. So now it's not, see, the way it was before, when you signed the listing agreement, we talked about this last night. When they make an offer of compensation, you are bound to it. So if they say, if they write in their listing agreement the current way, I will give 2.5, they have to give 2.5 because you posted in the MLS.
Yeah.
You try to not pay them the 2.5, that other broker is going to come after me for that.
But they have to then have a contract that's asking you for it instead of you offering it.
Correct. They're going to have to ask you. So your seller's not.
So
gonna
my
be-
seller can't go, nope,
Absolutely.
they can say no.
Absolutely.
Mm.
There is no
They
more
can change
broker to
it,
broker
yeah.
payments.
Mm.
There's going to be no more offer of compensation. The only compensation that a seller is going to be mandated and required to pay is the one that they make with you when they sign that listing agreement. When you say, I will sell your house for 3%, that's the only thing that they are being mandated to pay.
So then you can basically say, I know that you've signed to this saying that you're gonna pay them 2.5%, but now it's gonna have to be a conversation when I bring in a buyer, and then they're gonna have to ask you for it. Instead of you offering it, they're gonna give you a form that you're gonna sign that's gonna say that you're gonna pay it through them asking for it as opposed to you offering it.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how the RLA lines up as we do the listing agreement when it comes to dual representation. There might be something in there still. I don't think we're taking dual rep out where you can get, I wouldn't really change my dual rep though. Like I wouldn't deduct it because now I got a buyer over here. So I would still, it's like usually you would say 5% and then 4% if I bring the buyer. Now I'm just going to say like 3%. If I bring the buyer, don't worry about it. That buyer is going to owe me.
Right.
Now they could still ask you, and then I could say, so maybe it was 3 and maybe my buyer asks for 2.5. But maybe the seller says, no, I'll just pay 1. All right, now I could go back to my buyer and say, you still owe me 1.5, or I could go, you know what, man, we're good. I'm making 4. I'm good. You know, that's gonna play too. Go ahead. You had a question.
No, I'm still trying to wrap my mind around, so my listing clients are gonna want to reduce
Their
their
total,
compensation
their total compensation.
for
Yes.
the listing. at this
Mhm.
point. So we need to talk about.
Why is that? You don't tell them like, I will represent you for 3%?
No, what she means is right now she's got, let's say she's got a 5%er, 2.5, 2.5. They're gonna want to modify it now and drop it down to the just 2.5. They're not gonna want to
They
keep it
don't-
at 5.
Exactly,
They're gonna want to drop it.
but I want to keep it at 4.
Yeah.
I want to keep it at the agreed upon.
And why wouldn't they do that?
Why wouldn't they?
The sellers.
Why wouldn't they do what? Keep it at the 5? And
Absolutely.
But why?
because we go in right now and say, listen, you want to sell your house and I'm doing the best job I can. However, agents representing the buyers are working their tails off.
but that's not how it works, because
But we tell them that.
I cannot give the other broker part of your commission anymore.
No, but the sellers, I'm convincing the sellers.
No, because if you keep it at 5, when you go to contract, they have to pay you 5. You cannot give 2.5.
Is there not?
If
How
you-
does the seller compensate? I'm going to tell them when an offer is made, anticipate,
Mhm,
compensate
mhm.
the buyer's agent at 2%.
Correct,
can no
but how
longer-
do you sign your listing agreement? You-
That's what I'm
You
asking.
can't sign it for 5. You have to sign it for what you want to get paid and then tell them, be prepared. There's gonna be a.
Can there be an addendum on it?
So basically, there cannot. We had that question today. The question was, so I go in, I tell them 2.5% is what they're gonna pay me. Be prepared to offer. Can they write on a piece of paper somewhere what they're gonna be willing to do for concessions? And CAR's chief legal guy said, no. We do not want to see that paperwork anywhere. If you want to do that, have your broker talk to their attorney and draft legal paperwork between you and your client. CAR wants nothing to do with that. Because the DOJ's big thing is no broker to broker. They don't even want to mess around with that. So even the compensation part, it's basically like you just have to wait for the offer to roll in. And I kept saying, like, most agents are gonna ask you to pay their obligation because most buyers aren't gonna wanna do it. So, but if you sign your listing agreement at 5, they're gonna have to pay you the 5. And we can't give it up.
Okay, so they would pay me the 5.
So you have to keep it. You're not allowed to give it to anybody. I'm not allowed to give it to any other agent.
Not even a finder's fee?
No,
No.
that's illegal.
Yeah.
A finder's fee is
Who
illegal?
are you gonna give it to?
can't-
The other agent?
Yeah.
Can't give it.
No.
Who are you gonna give it to?
I was thinking of
Guess what I learned today?
Yeah, so you can't, so if they pay you the full 5, I cannot give it to another licensed agent at another house.
Okay, now, in the past, I have given finder's fees to other realtors for bringing in, not, for referring somebody to.
That's a referral.
That's a
Like
referral.
my mom.
That's a
Like
referral. That's
I can give
different.
my mom a
We can still do
referral.
referral fees,
Okay.
right? We're still referring because as a broker, I'm giving another broker part of your
You're gonna
commission.
have a lot of double agents.
Possibly, but again, it just depends because they're gonna have, because a buyer's not gonna be able to go to every single listing agent out there. Because then they're gonna end up having BRBCs all over the place. They're gonna have to pick a buyer.
Okay, but you can have a conversation. Let's say you're selling a house and it's at 5%. You can probably say to the buyer's agent and to your seller,
So wait.
I get it that you're willing to pay 2.5% to the buyer, okay? But we can't do that through this contract. So just expect to be asked
Yeah,
Just
but you have to sign yours for
Right,
2.5%.
right, but just expect to be asked for 2.5% and like, are you okay with that?
Mhm.
Yes.
That's a conversation you can have. You just can't document it anywhere. There's no place to document
Right,
that.
right.
on
It's
these
just a
forms.
conversation. So
Just
we're
a
gonna lower
conversation.
this to 2.
So what you really do is you walk in and you say, Mr. Seller, look, I'm willing to sell your house for 3%.
Mhm.
Okay, we cannot offer compensation anymore. Okay, but you're gonna get asked for compensation,
Right, so.
right? Because otherwise that buyer is probably not gonna have the ability to
Sure.
buy your house.
So just
So,
like tell your
But be
sellers.
prepared. And here's the thing, that offer of concessions is completely dependent upon how good that offer is.
Sure,
So if they write you a full price offer, be open to 2 to
Two-
2.5%.
right.
If they write you an offer for 10,000 under, don't be so
It's
open
just
to
kind
it.
of like preparing them, like be
Yeah.
prepared to get asked for this amount of money, depending on the offer, it's gonna get asked
So
for.
here's where the paradigm is difficult for us to make the shift. We are all still living in the paradigm that the seller is paying for everything. What the DOJ wants us to do is to shift the paradigm to seller pays the seller's broker, buyer pays the buyer's broker. That's what the DOJ wants in a perfect world. CAR is still trying to say, well, in the reality of the world, that's why we have the 3G3 and the SPBV. That's why those conversations are there where you can have concessions. We got lucky. We have concessions. What is concessions? It's just another way to produce compensation. But
Yeah.
it's a
Everything's
paradigm shift. And
negotiable.
we're going to continue to bump up against this if we continue to believe that the seller is responsible for everybody paying.
But I'm anticipating that my clients at a 4% listing are going to now want to drop that listing. I'm not okay with that. I mean, I might be. Are you okay with that? To them going down to a 3% listing from a 4%?
Why wouldn't I be happy with the 3%
Right.
listing for my agent? That
Right,
would be
that's
smoking
ideal.
good.
That's
Right,
ideal for
and
them.
I'm-
Anything
I'm
above
fine with that
2% in
too.
that case would make me happy,
Right,
right?
right.
He's not losing,
No, he's not losing.
he's winning. If we can. if
And in
we-
that particular
But I'm
case,
just
you're winning
wondering.
too, because
Yeah,
the
of
way it was
course.
originally written, it was probably 4-2. So
Right.
you're going from 2 to 2.5 to 3. So it's a win-win. I don't know what that's gonna look like with this modification form. I don't know if we're gonna come up with some language that automatically deletes that 2, or if it maintains that 4. I don't know. That's a really good question.
I'm really
Because
curious about that.
these offers of compensation are disappearing completely. Are you Harry carrying? She's got the scissors out ready to go.
Oh my God.
Guys, it's a huge, we're not even gonna be able to get through this whole form today. It's a huge change. So open to the floor, Julie, Jyoti, Marilyn, anybody, any questions about any of this stuff?
We can do it, we're gonna do it.
We have no choice but to do it. It's
Can you
happening.
hear me?
Yes.
It's so confusing. I need this gone over about 30 more times, and I'm not sure how we're gonna do it. It's just I almost like need a schematic of from point A to point B, and I think we're just gonna have to keep talking about it, because
So
it's just, I'm not worried about any of the conversation. I'm just worried about making sure that I have it straight in my head. And so I
I can
think
do
role
that.
playing is a big deal.
I can pull it out. I can build a schematic on that. That's not that hard.
Yeah, yeah.
Go ahead, keep going. You
No,
have more.
I'm just saying, I think that,
Round table it.
we have to really, do a lot of role playing and, throw in different scenarios and so forth, just so that we know, or at least for me, that I know exactly what I'm talking about. Because I do get asked that question at every listing appointment. Well, what's going on with the commissions now, or the concessions? Well, now that I got that down, now we're throwing that off the table. So,
So let's talk about that. What's going on with the commissions now? How do you answer that question when the seller
I
asks you?
start out with it, I don't.
Seller pays for the selling agent.
Yeah.
Buyer pays for the buyer.
Yeah, you pay me.
yeah.
That's it. Right? You pay me. That's the only thing we're gonna put on this agreement is what you pay me. And then
And
we're
if you're
gonna,
open to paying the buyer,
Absolutely.
then that's
Yeah.
a different
Okay.
contract. that will happen when somebody brings in an offer.
Mhm.
And asks for it, right? They have to
Yeah.
ask
Buyer's
for it.
agent- A buyer and a buyer's agent is most likely going to try to negotiate some more compensation for their agent. It's going to be on a case by case, offer by offer basis. Like I said before, we're not only going to just be negotiating price and terms on a contract, we're going to be negotiating price, terms, and concessions. It's just a third thing to throw in there that we're going to be negotiating on every single offer.
So technically, could the buyer and buyer's agent write in the RPA, we want 1%, and then the buyer is
Yes.
going to pay his agent or their agent, whatever they want. We don't care what that is. We only care what they're asking us for.
Correct. So only what's in 3G1. If it's just 1%, it's 1%. It doesn't matter.
Right.
So if you have a buyer who's willing to give you 1.5% on a 2.5% total, then you're only going to be asking the seller in the RPA for 1%.
Right.
Okay. Do we need to go look at that form? Do we need to take a look at the RPA real quick?
Hold on.
Possibly.
Guys, did you set an appointment?
Sure.
Yeah, and I'm gonna change the way I'm thinking about this. I'm not gonna worry about the buyer's side.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go to my clients and say, compensation remains the same. You pay your seller, and then we'll deal with it when we get an offer.
And we're going to be ahead of the curve on this, guys, because right now at this particular point in time, we're the only office in town that even knows that this is going on, because this literally happened an hour and a half ago.
Oh,
And all I've done is just allude to it, and I haven't said anything to anybody yet. So let's take a look at the RPA when I pull it up. Forms.
I thought you were saying that somebody had already set up an appointment to go check out the 3D.
Sorry, but when I have the Zoom running at the same time, this just moves a little bit slow, so.
And I don't know who the appointment was with.
Does that sometimes. I don't look at it. Who has an active? We'll go look at this one. This will work. All right, residential purchase agreement. This thing's going to be changing a little bit, but not too much. All right, there it is right there, paragraph 3G3.
Perfect, or just text.
Right here. And so again, almost every single one that we've gotten in the last year and a half has looked just like this, blank, unchecked. Okay, so now you're going to be seeing them all checked. They're all going to have a checkbox right here. Seller agrees to pay the obligation of the buyer, right? The obligation belongs to the buyer. What is the obligation? To compensate their broker. So now the seller is agreeing to assume that obligation. We are shifting the obligation to pay the buyer's broker from the buyer to the seller right here by checking that box. Okay. So this probably is going to change. Seller's broker offer, any compensate broker, blah, blah. So there is going to be no more seller brokers offer. This is going to be eliminated because there's no more broker to broker compensation. There is no seller broker offer. Okay.
Shouldn't there be something that says,
Sorry.
seller agrees to pay obligation of buyer to compensate buyer's broker under a separate agreement? Okay, and a separate agreement,
Is the BRBC.
and that'll, and that will, spell it out.
Yeah, so what they mean by under a separate agreement, for you to check this box currently, your BRBC must be executed prior to the writing of this offer.
Okay.
If it's not, then there is no separate agreement, there is no obligation. So that's why this is never even used, because hardly anybody signs a BRBC. Up here, maybe 3 people, maybe. So now that there's gonna have to be a BRBC, there will be a separate agreement and it will talk about the obligation. So now the seller's agreeing to pay it. So when you check that, you're gonna go to form SPBB. Problem is SPBB is being modified again. And basically what SPBB says is that the BRBC signed between the buyer and the buyer's agent is at 2.5%. We're asking you to pay 2.5%. And they can't ask for any more. But Julie, to your point, you can ask for less.
Mhm.
So you could have on that SPBB saying that I have a BRBC for 2.5% and seller we're asking you to pay one of it,
Right.
right? So, and then the buyer would either pay the other 1.5%, because I don't know why you would just walk away and just work for 1%. So, you know, it just really depends on every single offer. And I could also see a lot of us just preempting purchase prices by writing for $10,000 over, just to put your compensation, make sure it's good. So if you see a house on the market for 400,000, you know, and you tell your buyer, hey, look, you have to pay me 2.5%, that's 10K. The easiest way for you to pay me, if I don't think the seller's gonna take that $10,000 hit, is just to write this for 410 and then ask them to pay, right? Because now the net bottom line for the seller doesn't change. So again, see, you can see where this dichotomy exists of whose mind are we having to change here, the buyers or the sellers. We really should be discussing with the sellers, just because we're reducing our commissions from 6 to 3. Don't expect it to stay there. They're gonna ask, right? But again, they're gonna get greedy. They're gonna be like, no, I want it all. You know, you put $10,000 in front of the seller, he's gonna want it. You're not gonna want to give it up. So a lot of quiet people in here. Quiet people. Okay. All right, guys, that's enough for today. That's an hour, a little over an hour. Like, we didn't even make it to paragraph 5. We're only on page 2 of 4. I mean, really, most of this you've seen already. There's not a whole lot in here that, I mean, I think we covered the main stuff, and the main stuff lives in these first 4 paragraphs. So I think we're pretty good here on this. This form is going to change a little bit. That's why I really haven't shared it with you. And I did discover today. So I left on the 18th to go to Europe, and there was an emergency meeting on the 20th that I missed. And in that emergency meeting, they told us about that list of 16 or 17 forms that were going to be held back. That's why I think Mariana was looking for the new RLA yesterday. It's not out yet. It's not coming out for 2 more weeks.
And what do we do with our current list?
Current listings, you don't do anything with them until August 17th. So if you can get something under contract now, it's the way it's always been.
Yeah.
Offers of compensation are still out there. But once August 17th comes, we're going to have to make just an on the fly roll. So, yeah, and there will be a modification for every listing and for every BRBC that is already in place. There's a modification for both of those forms. And that's it. Just those 2, because those are the only 2 agreements. One for the buyer, one for the seller. All right. Any questions?
We're gonna have role play on this, right?
What about from the group? We can. You know how much I love role play. Things in the world.
Why?
But I don't know. It just, I always just feel so goofy doing
It
it.
is.
All right. Any questions from anybody else? All
No.
good. All right, guys. Thank you for attending online. Thank you for attending in person.
Hi, Julie.
Hi
Thanks,
there. I
Debbie.
miss you guys.
Oh, no.
Hi, Cheryl.
Did you get my text, Julie?
I did, and I haven't responded because I just don't know how to respond. I don't